Socialist Legacy. I am Reed Kane. Thank you for joining us. We are streaming here on the Sublation Media Twitch channel every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern. So if you're not watching this live, definitely try to join us next time. We would love to um, have you involved in the discussion in the chat. So today, I'm going to resume the discussion we began last week of a piece by Monty Johnstone on the concept of the proletarian party in Marx and Engels. And I'm doing this kind of deep read through of this piece in preparation for an article I'm working on engaging with primarily the so-called Ackerman plan, the article by Seth Ackerman in the winter 2016 issue of Jacobin magazine titled "A Blueprint for a New Party." And by way of that article, I'm trying to kind of engage with a deeper question in the milieu of DSA and Jacobin magazine with regard to what the nature of an independent working class party would be and why that would be necessary, and whether or not that kind of theoretical background is well understood in the assessments of that prospect that are kind of typical of those circles. So I'm planning on our next session next week to discuss the Ackerman piece in particular in more detail. So I will kind of go a little bit deeper into what I think some of the issues with that perspective are. But to set it up a little bit more concretely with respect to the historical perspective, um, the the Johnstone piece is a really concise and systematic exposition of the role of the party in the perspective of Marx and Engels and in their political career, engaging with the working class movement of their time. So I began discussing this piece last week with Clint, who will be joining me for this discussion after some initial remarks today. Last week we kind of went into the piece a little bit, kind of freewheeling, just sort of discussing things as they came up. And I wanted to put a finer point on some of the essential arguments that Johnstone is making, or that Johnstone is sort of teasing out of Marx and Engels, in order to make sure that this kind of essential point about the nature of the class independence of the proletarian party is not kind of missed. Last week, I primarily addressed what I would say are one of the kind of two basic elements of the concept of the proletarian party in Marx. And this, again, is something I'm getting from Johnstone's presentation. So the kind of two basic elements, or the element that I dealt with for the most part in the last session, was what I would call the dialectic of theory and practice, or what is also known as the merger formula, namely the notion that the Socialist Party serves as the means of merging the socialist movement, which is a movement of bourgeois, kind of radical utopian intellectuals, and the proletarian class struggle, the working class movement, to address and ultimately overcome the proletarianized condition of labor that develops with the Industrial Revolution. And we'll go into that in a little more detail in a moment. The second element I did address a little bit in the previous episode, but I wanted to kind of put a put a finer point on it today, and that would be the class independence of the proletarian party, or really the question of what constitutes the proletarian party as a distinct party of the proletariat. What makes it an independent party of the working class? This is, I think, a very confusing and poorly understood issue in contemporary discussions that harken back to these terms, that try to deal with the aspiration today to build some kind of working class party or party rooted in the working class, or what have you, or socialist party for that matter, where that kind of conception is acceptable. So, the first kind of disclaimer I would make about this is that the temptation when discussing this conception of class independence would be to characterize the class character of a party sociologically, which is to say, in terms of the kind of sociological background of the members, participants, um, and for that matter, the people seeking representation through such a party, or that the party is seeking to represent. Um, so, in that sense, you could say that a proletarian party or a working class party has that character because it's made up of proletarians, it's made up of working class people, and that it aspires to represent or advance or um, the interests of, or to lead the working class as a kind of group in society. And while there's obviously an element of truth to that, in the sense that, of course, when we're talking about a proletarian party, that is, intended to be a party made up of proletarians, at least primarily, and that does seek to give expression to, political expression to, and act upon the interests of proletarians, of working class people, wage laborers, industrial wage laborers in particular. But the difficulty here is that the character of the proletariat as a class is not reducible to the individual constituents of that class. And the class interests of the proletariat, its interests as a class, are not simply the sum total of, or otherwise some sort of amalgamation of, the interests of any particular group of proletarians, say those that are organized in or seeking to be represented by a party claiming to be a proletarian party, or even for that matter, the kind of amalgamation of the interests of all proletarians, however that might be achieved, or imagined to be achieved. The sociological character of the party in terms of its class composition is secondary, and of course, it's not unimportant. It's reflective of the um, it's reflective of the character of the party in important ways. But the essence of the class independence of the party is not a sociological fact. And for that matter, it can only really be understood in political terms. Um, of course, being a political party, it should be obvious, but it kind of is a bit of an obscure point today. So I'm going to try to flesh out what I mean by that in terms of the political character of the party's definition as an independent proletarian party, a party representing the class independence of the proletariat, of the working class. So before I dive into the presentation, I'm going to, as I said, deliver some prepared remarks. And then Clint's going to come in and we're going to discuss what I've been talking about, and also inviting anyone in the chat to participate, ask questions, or leave comments. So I hopefully won't take too long. I think maybe I have about 20, 30 minutes worth of remarks here, and then we'll open it up. Okay, so there are two elements to the independent character of the proletarian party with respect to the political self-definition of such a party. Or you can break it down into, I think, two kind of essential elements. And really, you can't separate them. They're essentially interrelated, but for purposes of clarification, you could say that the first essential element defining this independence is that such a party is seeking to organize the proletariat into a class, as the Communist Manifesto famously puts it. It's seeking to organize the proletariat as a class for itself, as Marx put it in The Poverty of Philosophy. The proletariat must pass from a class in itself to a class for itself. This means organizing the entire working class on the scale of the nation, all workers within the nation, that is, that share in the common political context. So, regardless of all particular characteristics, including nationality, citizenship status, and race, gender, etc., but also industry and skill and so on. I mean, any kind of any characteristics by which workers might be distinguished from and divided against one another. The goal is to overcome those divisions through a common organization. Not only would this mean organizing the working class on the scale of the nation as a whole, but also uniting in this effort with similar efforts in other countries to form a single world party of the international working class, which is to say, the working class proper. So the working class, the proletariat, as we discussed last week, is essentially international. It's an international class. It's sort of a convenient fudge to talk about the proletariat of a given nation. Um, what we're really talking about is the way in which the international class is constituted within a given political formation. But those political boundaries are not fundamental in any sense. And in fact, what's fundamental is the overcoming, the kind of stalled, interrupted overcoming of national divisions that characterizes the belated and necessary, but as yet incomplete international revolution that capitalism sort of inaugurates, but is unable to bring through to completion. So, what makes the proletariat a distinct class? Proletarian refers to the condition of the working class that resulted from the Industrial Revolution, a condition that distinguishes the modern working class from its historical predecessors. And the term proletarian is a term from ancient Rome, referring to the class of citizens that did not own property. And in the context of ancient Rome, that meant did not own land. On one hand, it refers to a condition that affects all workers, and in a sense, the whole of society after the Industrial Revolution, this proletarian condition. The principle of bourgeois society is labor. It is the society of labor, of the third estate, those who work in terms of the medieval caste system, as distinguished from the first estate, the clergy, those who pray, and the second estate, the aristocracy, those who fight, the warrior caste. Bourgeois society is the society of labor, a society founded upon the emancipation of the working class. The overcoming of its domination by the first and second estates. The basis of social order, social relations, became labor. Every individual was free to transform nature by his own efforts and to live on the basis of doing so, and to relate to others through this process and its results. Hence, the new form of property, bourgeois private property, that would replace aristocratic property based on the right of conquest and clerical property based on divine right, was based upon the right of the laborer to property in the product of his labor. Property is often today treated as synonymous with possession. This is something that makes it difficult to make clear sense of what was at stake in the socialist theory of the 19th century, and especially Marx. That when we read the word property, we often think possession, we think personal possessions. Um, we think in terms of the personal possessions that we consume in order to live. But this is different from property. If you think in terms of an investment, as distinct from, say, an article of clothing or an appliance or food that you might eat. An investment is not an article of direct consumption. It's something you own, but it's not something that you consume. Rather, it is a source of increasing value, or it's supposed to be in any case, that in principle could continue to expand indefinitely in value without ever being consumed. Or perhaps that's not possible as a kind of concrete reality, but that's the ideal. This is closer, this sense of property, if we think in terms of, say, an investment, is closer to the older sense of property that was current in the 19th century, and certainly among socialists. Not simply something that we possess in order to consume, not merely an article of consumption, but one's means of life, one's livelihood, that by which one is able to make or otherwise acquire the necessities and conveniences which one must consume in order to subsist. Hence, to say that one has a right to property in the product of one's labor is to say that one has the right to live by way of transforming nature through one's labor into the means of life, the means of one's own subsistence. In that sense, it's also helpful to think, if we go back to that example, the ancient example of Rome, property was in ancient society land, or it could also be chattel, it could be slaves, but the principal form of property was land. It was that by which you were able to grow, quite literally, the means of your subsistence and thus live. To be a proletarian in the ancient sense is to be without property and hence without a livelihood, a means of producing one's own means of life, and hence it is dependency upon others and upon the property of others to provide the means of life. The notion that the working class was becoming proletarian as a result of the Industrial Revolution was, from the bourgeois revolutionary standpoint, an absurdity, a contradiction in terms. Of course, for the capitalist class in the period of the class struggle, this absurdity was sort of manifested as um, as a tendency to regard the opposition to the proletarian condition as sort of overblown. Whereas for the workers, they lived this absurdity. they suffered from it. They were not able to sort of deny that this absurdity was a reality because they were saddled with it directly. A worker, in bourgeois revolutionary terms, should not be without property because he should be able to acquire property by virtue of engaging in labor, by virtue of working. The property of the worker, the livelihood by which he produces his means of life, is the essential product of his production process, of his labor, with particular commodities produced only as means to this end, as forms of appearance of the real product, not merely particular articles of consumption, that is, but the capacity to produce one's own subsistence, the means of this production, the means of independently reproducing oneself. So, this is the property that the worker is entitled to as a result of his labor. The, it's not the commodities he may produce to sell, because, of course, you're not producing commodities simply for their own sake. You're doing it in order to acquire something for yourself. And while you could look at that in a narrow sense, that you sell commodities in order to acquire money so that you can purchase means of subsistence, what you're more importantly doing is accumulating the means of producing for, indefinitely into the future, to producing one subsistence indefinitely. You're not just trying to live day to day, but to have a livelihood that you can live on. This self-contradictory character of proletarianization indicated that as a result of the introduction of large-scale industry, production was increasingly conducted by means of the cooperation of ever greater numbers of workers, and specifically in forms of cooperation embodied in machinery, to which the workers themselves became subordinate, secondary, and in relation to which their labor became increasingly superfluous and dispensable. This required, and by destroying the possibility of competing in the market as small scale commodity producers themselves, this reproduced an ever greater mass of people available to work, to sell their ability to work for a wage, because they are dependent upon wage labor to live. They are dependent on someone employing them because they lack the means of employing themselves, of producing commodities independently as individuals. Wage labor was previously seen in the bourgeois period, the bourgeois epoch. It was previously seen as only a temporary condition on the way to independent proprietorship, whether that be of land or artisanal handicraft. The rise of large-scale industry created a new class of permanent wage laborers who would never own the means of employing themselves and thus producing their own subsistence, but who instead were and would always be dependent upon owners of capital to hire them in exchange for means of subsistence adequate to keep them coming back to work, but no more, certainly not enough to allow them to overcome their dependency on wage labor. Um, of course, you want to maintain your workforce. You don't want to, um, enable them to leave you behind. So, industrial wage laborers were proletarian in that they did not retain the product of their labor as their own property, but worked to produce property for their employers, receiving in return only enough to maintain themselves in this condition of dependency. Wage laborers were furthermore proletarianized in that they faced the ever present reality of unemployment, whether as a looming threat or an immediate problem. the condition of losing access even to the property of an employer by not being able to find an employer to hire you. And unemployment in the sense of kind of chronic unemployment, this mass of unemployed people always there looking for work, ready to work, desperate for work, and into which you are risking falling if you are um, let go of your job or you leave your job. That's a phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution, just as this kind of um, permanent or hereditary condition of wage labor. Wage laborers owning no property of their own were by default unemployed, and hence were fortunate to find and keep a steady job. Society more generally was subject to proletarianization, including, of course, those workers who were not mere wage laborers, who did not work in large scale industry or for commodity producing enterprises of any size, but also including property owners, because anyone could, in principle, lose that property and thereby confront this proletarian condition. The ability to escape wage labor and unemployment was likewise a matter of good fortune that could shift at any time for anyone, as all are subject to economic forces beyond our control and understanding. So the capitalist is, in a sense, proletarianized as much as the worker, but insulated from this condition by their property. Um, but that insulation, that protection, is not it's not a status they inherit and will maintain for the rest of their life, as with the caste status of, say, medieval aristocrats. It was something that could be at any time revoked by the whims of economic forces that are beyond the mastery of any individual capitalist as much as they're beyond the mastery of the individual workers. So the proletariat, in the most restricted sense, includes wage laborers employed in large scale industry, as well as the unemployed, those that are seeking employment, not those that have adapted to poverty by finding other means of subsisting, such as charity, criminality, or other relations of dependency. So the unemployed are, in this sense, people that are looking for work, that are trying to find work, that haven't fallen out of the workforce. So the proletariat includes industrial wage laborers as well as the unemployed, whose condition is the result of large scale industry, this unemployed condition, as I said earlier. The proletariat is the class of industrial wage laborers, employed or seeking employment in the production, not necessarily of physical commodities in a factory. That's one way in which you may be um, a proletarian, that you may be employed as a industrial wage laborer, but it's not the only means of being employed in the production of value in in industrial capitalism, because what industrial capitalism is about is not producing commodities but producing surplus value. So being an industrial wage laborer, being a proletarian, is a matter of being employed in the production of surplus value by means of large scale industry. And you know, this is a point that is developed in great detail in volume 2 of Das Kapital. Um, but the um, there are all manner of elements in the circulation of commodities that contribute to the surplus value of those commodities. It's not simply a matter of the labor that goes into the physical production of a good. And of course, not all commodities are physical, tangible objects for that matter. But it's the production of surplus value that's crucial. But the working class more broadly also includes wage laborers employed by small commodity producers, small businesses, employed by nonprofit organizations, and employed by the state. As well, the working class as well includes petty bourgeois, self employed small proprietors, all of whom are drawn into the orbit of proletarianization, all of whom have this same threat of being cast into the labor market hanging over them, but who have means of escaping unemployment and starvation that put them in a less clear, direct position with regard to the problem of proletarianization than workers who are employed by large capitalist enterprises or who are unemployed. Hence, the industrial proletariat should be the vanguard, the most advanced section of the working class with regard to this problem and the efforts to solve it. They confront this problem most directly, most acutely, and are hence in the position to both struggle against it most directly and to grasp it most clearly, consciously. The industrial proletariat should be the vanguard, the most advanced section of the working class with regard to this problem and the efforts to solve it, not simply the most discontented and agitated and vocal, but most concerned with transforming the whole social order. So it's not that the industrial workers are the most aggrieved or most, for that matter, most oppressed or the poorest necessarily. It's that they are in the position to grasp the true depth of the problem and the necessity of overcoming that problem through the transformation of the entire ensemble of social relations from which it derives, really overcoming the contradiction of this ensemble of social relations, the contradiction of the social form that proletarianization manifests. Hence, the proletariat is tasked not only with organizing itself, but the whole working class, including all of those layers beyond the industrial proletariat, around this common problem. Even if reaching the, so to speak, outer layers or the satellites that kind of orbit around the industrial proletariat, including in some, rare but certainly not unheard of cases, the odd disgruntled capitalist. Engels, of course, being in a disgruntled capitalist in this sense. And there were others in the Socialist Party of America, for example. There was a milieu of so-called millionaire socialists who bankrolled a lot of the party's activity. It is tasked with organizing not only itself, the proletariat is tasked with organizing the whole working class around this problem and even bringing in any elements that might sympathize with and take up this struggle and this standpoint. But those elements kind of outside of the core of the industrial proletariat, of industrial wage laborers, um, bringing them into this struggle, organizing them into this struggle to overcome proletarianization is a more or less fraught proposition, and that differs in different cases for different reasons. Um, but it's more complicated. It's not as straightforward to win over, say, people that are employed by the state or small business owners, or for that matter, capitalists, of course. It's much more of a difficult and unlikely proposition to win them over to this struggle. Nonetheless, the widest swath of society would have to be ultimately won over to see this struggle through to its completion. And winning over those sorts of outer layers of the working class and the middle strata between the working class and the capitalist class would be expected to result from the advanced development of this movement. It wouldn't be something that would happen, right away or early on. It would be something that happens in the heat of kind of revolutionary conflict when people are drawn to one side or the other, or thrown from one side to the other by the force of circumstances and events. Thus, the goal of organizing the proletarians into a class means organizing the working class as a whole. First and foremost, wage laborers employed by large capitalist enterprises, as well as the unemployed. And secondarily, wage laborers and working people more broadly, around the goal of overcoming the problem of the proletarian condition of labor in capitalism. The independence of the proletariat thus resides principally in the aspiration to constitute the proletariat as an independent class that recognizes and is striving to realize its independent interests as distinct from and ultimately opposed to those of the capitalist class, and hence the broad array of elements in society that accept and defer to the leadership of the capitalist class in society, and that seek to preserve that role by political means, which is to say, those who see their interests in maintaining the existing social order, maintaining the subordination of labor to capital. And that, of course, could include workers and proletarian workers as well as anyone else. So the second element of this independence, if the first element of the independence of the proletarian party is defined by its goal of organizing the proletariat as a class, organizing the class as a whole around this these common interests in prosecuting this struggle, then to what end ultimately is this organization undertaken? What are the distinct interests of the proletariat? What would overcoming the proletarian condition mean and require? So the second element is the conquest of political power. So organizing the proletariat to what end? To the end of the conquest of political power. It is this struggle that first leads to the division and antagonism between the proletarian movement and the radical democracy, the bourgeois radical democracy, from which it from which it kind of splits off. The proletariat struggled for democratic reforms to wield political power in order to redress the social conditions to which they were subjected. And when I'm speaking specifically about the historical example of the English proletariat in the 1840s, 1830s, and 40s, and specifically Chartism, the Chartist movement, which we discussed last week. It was this substance of the proletarian struggle for democracy, namely the substance defined by the social question, the fraught social conditions of the proletariat, and specifically the question of how to overcome those conditions, to redress and rectify the situation, this kind of deteriorating social condition. It was this substance of social needs, social demands, the need for social transformation of the proletarian struggle for democracy that led to the opposition of the bourgeois Democrats and their break with the proletarian wing of the democratic movement, and made plain the distinct class division between their interests and political aspirations and those of the proletariat, or the distinction of the interests of the bourgeoisie in a sense, its best form, namely the radical democracy of the early 19th century, following on from the revolutions of the 18th century, the American and French revolutions. Hence, the full criterion for class independence is the goal of organizing the proletariat to conquer political power. It's this goal, the fact that the party is organized around this goal, is seeking to realize this goal, that defines the independent class character of the proletarian party. A party would be an independent party of the working class to the extent that it is seeking to organize the working class as a whole around the goal of conquering political power. So this is the basic substance of socialism for Marx. The significance of the socialist movement for the class struggle of the proletariat is clarifying this necessity. That's not to say that the victory of the proletariat in its struggle for political power and the ensuing political rule of the working class, the dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx calls it, would itself be socialism. That's not to say that what Marx understood by socialism would be the rule of the working class. That's not the point. Or for that matter, that upon claiming political power, the proletariat would then immediately institute socialism. Again, that would not be possible in Marx's view. And that's not the relationship between these ideas, the idea of class independence and the ideological role of socialism in the proletarian class struggle. That's not Marx's understanding of this relationship. Rather, the point is that the content of socialist and communist ideas for Marx is negative. It is the overcoming of bourgeois social relations of labor. It is not a matter of some particular vision or system of society that must be implemented, or for that matter, some set of reforms that must be implemented, but rather freeing the capacity of society to consciously transform itself by raising those who bear this capacity, that is, the proletarians as a class, as the collective worker, into its conscious political leadership. So this is the political significance of the proletariat. The proletariat has to be understood not as a mass of individual wage laborers, but as the ensemble of labor involved in the social production process that capitalism constitutes. And of course, the individual workers are, become part of this collective worker, and not just when they're employed, but also when they're unemployed. They participate in this class character, but that doesn't mean that their understanding of reality or of their immediate needs or immediate interests is simply defined or circumscribed by the class to which they belong. In a sense, they have to come to understand that they are not merely individuals struggling to live on the basis of their labor, on the basis of their individual labor in bourgeois society through commerce, through exchanging the products of their labor, but rather that they live on the basis of socialized labor into which they are incorporated in large-scale industry, and through which, as part of this collective worker, they are part of the process through which society is continuously constituted and reproduced, and for that matter, continuously transformed. The working class collectively, the proletariat collectively, as a collective worker, as the agents of the social production process of capitalism, are what they are collectively responsible for what society is and how it changes. So the political significance of the proletariat, the mission, the task the proletariat has to come to understand and take up, again, not as individuals, but as part of a class that's organizing itself as a class, conscious of its interests as a class, is their recognition of their responsibility for the order of things, the order of society as it is. The proletariat has to grasp and take conscious responsibility for the central role it plays in making society what it is, and hence in inflicting upon itself the conditions from which it suffers by virtue of its failure to consciously grasp and take responsibility for those conditions. Marx believed that the working class would be compelled, upon taking political power, to follow through on the socialization of production and the consequent abolition of private property and wage labor that already defines capitalism, but that in capitalism is constrained by the need to reproduce bourgeois social relations, and that hence manifests in distorted, grotesque forms: monopolization and unemployment. So capitalism is abolishing private property in the means of production by socializing the production process. Marx puts it that one capitalist kills many. This is the process by which capitals are constantly being drawn together, concentrated, and centralized into ever larger accumulations that crowd out all smaller competitors in a tendency towards kind of universal monopolization. Of course, not a tendency that is expected to ever be realized as such under capitalism. And the same thing with wage labor. Wage labor is rendered superfluous through the introduction of industrial technique and machinery into the production process. And this, in a sense, abolishes wage labor, casting laborers into the reserve army of the unemployed. But nonetheless, they still depend upon and demand wage labor, even though their role in society has been eliminated. And on that basis, wage labor as well as private property in the means of production are reconstituted in and through the process by which they are being abolished, in being socialized, becoming social, a social production process, social property. Capital is social property that's misrecognized, misunderstood, misappropriated as the private property of individuals, not by the fault of the capitalists, of course, who are in a sense simply doing what you know of what anyone would presumably do in that position, or what most people would presumably do, namely living on the basis of what they have been fortunate enough to inherit or accumulate. That's not it's not the capitalist's fault that society is constituted this way. Even if, as Max Horkheimer put it, they may have wanted it to be so constituted. Rather, it's the fault, as it were, of the workers, again, not as individuals, but collectively, for leaving this role to the capitalists rather than taking it up themselves. And the responsibility of the workers, the task of the working class, is to take this role upon themselves through the conquest of political power. The exact form and course this would take namely, the exact form and course that the realization of the potential of socialized production under the rule of the working class, the precise form this would take could not be laid out ahead of time, but would have to be worked through gradually in a process involving the active, conscious participation and deliberation of the immense majority of people. Socialism and communism signified the final withering away not only of private property and wage labor, but ultimately social relations based upon necessary or compulsory labor altogether. So this is the abolition of class of class society, the overcoming of what made the division of society into classes, the need to impose the burden of compulsory labor on a part of the population. This would be overcome. This raises the other essential element of the party concept that we discussed last week, the merger formula or the dialectic of theory and practice, namely the Socialist Party as uniting the socialist movement and the labor movement, socialist intellectuals, and the class struggle of the proletariat. What the socialists have to provide is not a vision of the future or system to be implemented, but rather consciousness of the historical process that led to the class struggle of the proletariat and through which that struggle will have to work itself out. Consciousness of the historic task facing the proletarian movement and hence the conditions of their ultimate victory. Marx and Engels vigorously opposed their conception of this dialectic to the sectarianism that dominated the socialist movement when they joined it, and that continued to dominate it for some time afterwards. By sectarianism, what's meant is the tendency of socialist intellectuals to close themselves off to the real movement of historical transformation, that is, to the class struggle of the proletariat, in favor of some vision or plan to be imposed upon society to which they seek to win adherents, converts. And this vision or plan may not even necessarily be a vision of a future society. It may not be the utopian picture of a socialist society, but could even simply be a vision of how the struggle of the proletariat must unfold, what the workers must do. So the sectarian tendency is to seek to impose upon the real movement of history some intellectual conception rather than seeking to raise the process as it unfolds to consciousness by participating in it and clarifying its own conception of what it's doing for itself. While Marx and Engels were always ready to argue with and polemicize against such visionary intellectuals and their followers, they were willing to cooperate so long as such intellectuals participated in the movement in good faith and submitted to democratic discipline. So Marx and Engels invited the Proudhonists into the First International, despite their antipathy for Proudhon and his ideas. And likewise, they eventually invited Bakunin and his followers as well. And the conflict with Bakunin and the split with the anarchists was a result not of Marx and Engels disagreeing with Bakunin's theoretical perspective on the revolution that would inaugurate socialism, but rather Bakunin's refusal to abide by the democratic organization and constitution of the First International, and hence to kind of accede to the authority Marx and Engels had earned as leaders of that organization, that movement. What Marx and Engels detested was the tendency to make such theoretical disputes into the basis of organized isolation, separating socialist ideas from the broad movement of the working class by constituting a separate organization for those who agree with those ideas, to which they are seeking to win converts, to essentially try to build a sect in a quite literal sense. Marx saw such organizations as obstructing the process of development of the class struggle and class consciousness, at least where the organizations in question were of any consequence, such as, for example, those that were composed of ostensible adherents of Marxism. And there were numerous examples of sectarian Marxists who Marx disavowed or was very harshly critical of. Marx saw such organizations as obstructing the process of development of the class struggle, at least where such organizations were of any consequence, by impeding the permeation of the real movement by socialist ideas. For the workers had to work through the appeal of these ideas in the course of their struggle to clarify that struggle and its ultimate aims, rather than either clinging to or rejecting these ideas dogmatically. Or worse, by dividing substantial parts of the working class along dubious lines where they should be united in common struggle. That is not to say that Marx and Engels favored unity above all. They thought that legitimate splits would arise at a relatively mature phase of development of the movement as symptoms of its maturity, the result of advanced controversies arising from the movement's growth and strength, the emergence of conservative elements seeking to preserve the success of the movement and their own place within it at the expense of its ultimate goal. The need for the ruling class to use this movement, and especially such conservative elements within it, to preserve the social order that it otherwise threatened, and the conflict between such elements and the genuinely proletarian elements that remained clear about and dedicated to their task. So the dialectic, in this sense, is a matter of theory helping to clarify the practical struggle, helping clarify what the problem they are struggling with is and how it might be solved, not simply by giving the correct answer, but by helping the different perspectives and tendencies within the movement to articulate themselves and their differences. The practical struggle then tests the adequacy and coherence of these different perspectives, and thereby clarifies these theoretical disputes. This is why the fullest internal democracy was, in Marx and Engels' view, necessary for the proletarian party, and why the movement depended upon civil freedoms, such as freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of the press, to propagate its message. It needed to reach as many people as possible and involve them not only in a practical struggle, but also an effort to theoretically grasp society, to think through and become conscious of the problem prompting this struggle. Marx and Engels saw themselves, by virtue of their advanced theoretical consciousness in their own esteem, as the nucleus or embryo of a future party in Germany. And this was in the 1840s and 1850s. This is how they saw themselves. A future party in Germany and the continent more broadly. In the 1840s, there was such a party in England, the Chartist Party, or the Chartist organization, which unfortunately ended up collapsing and setting back the British labor movement indefinitely, ultimately. So they weren't seeking to outdo Chartism. They were seeking to spread what the Chartists had already achieved to the rest of Europe. Their theoretical perspective was precisely that the proletariat must organize itself as a class, which meant politically as well as economically. They sought to work within the broader democratic movement in which the emerging proletariat was subsumed to help define this independent position and win the workers over to it, not as a separate sectarian organization, but as a perspective on what was necessary and a tendency within the real movement. The workers had to constitute themselves in such an organization, to see the necessity of doing so for themselves, and thereby to see the Marxist theoretical standpoint confirmed and worthy of their assent, worthy of their agreement of taking it up. They did not claim, Marx and Engels did not claim to have themselves created the true organization of the proletariat, which the workers must join in order to have proper leadership, but wanted the workers to recognize the correctness of their views for themselves by putting those views to the test within the real movement, within the struggle and their effort to clarify that struggle theoretically through their internal education, debate, discourse. So the working class is, in a sense, tasked with realizing the potential that is theoretically grasped and articulated in Marx's theory. Of course, not as a theoretical conjuration, but rather as a reflection on the historical significance of the class struggle of the English proletariat and the organization of the Chartist Party. The theoretical vanguard, in this case, Marx and Engels themselves, should not isolate itself in their view from the real movement, but seek to push the whole movement forward, to lead it at any given point to the next step of development of its struggle, and thus to help it avoid not only missteps, but also the inherent threat of self-contradiction, of collapsing back into what it is trying to overcome, of failing to grasp and learn from the broad arc of history in which it is situated. In other words, of simply reproducing the problem they're struggling against rather than doing what's necessary to ultimately overcome it. They sought to drive the movement forward in the sense of pushing it to engage in ever more pronounced conflicts with the capitalist class and the state, and hence to clarify the task that they were undertaking, the task that was set for them by their historic interests as a class, by rendering the struggle more acute, more intense, and hence rendering the theoretical controversies within the movement more acute, and thereby clarifying them. They would earn their intellectual and ultimately organizational leadership, Marx and Engels would, by virtue of the merits of their theoretical views, which the workers would encounter and consider in their efforts to make sense of their conditions and struggle. So the point here is that the task of Marxists is not to simply build the party that the workers need to come to. That would be the sectarian way of going about it. The workers need to come to the need to build the party for themselves. But what the Marxists need to do is, on the one hand, provide the theoretical perspective that clarifies this necessity, and on the other hand, to engage with the real movement in such a way, not that they are, in a sense, opposing themselves to the real movement by opposing what they see as the necessary and correct steps to be taken to those that are actually being taken, but rather helping the movement see the next step forward by providing a broad historical outlook for the process of which they're a part. And the real movement, the workers involved in the real movement, in the struggle, may or may not take that guidance as to how to move forward with their struggle. But the point would be, Marx and Engels were vindicated in their theoretical perspective because the guidance they were able to give the movement by virtue of that perspective was good advice. It was good guidance. It did actually clarify what was necessary and what would help the movement progress forward. Theoretical clarity of consciousness. Clarity of consciousness of the sources and ultimate implications of the class division, the distinct class interests of the proletariat, and the historical task this imposes upon them. This is the role of the party. The essential thing is to clarify these divisions rather than muddling or obscuring them. Okay, so that went a little longer than I was planning to. I apologize for that, but that concludes my prepared remarks. Clint, I don't know if you're there, if you'd like to jump back in. I see there's some comments here already.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Reid. That was awesome. So just for everybody who's watching right now, if you've got any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. I think I would start off with one. Actually, there's a couple of directions of questions that I would take this, but one of them is, so you were talking about how working through the various ideas that are being proposed, and showing how, like, so it's not just like imposing a new idea, but actually working through the various ones. And you started off with this shift in private property itself, from so let's say the property and labor of the third estate to its industrial crisis. So maybe just to kind of start illustrating that and bringing it out. The Marx is first, having to contest with the Proudhonists, and then later with the state socialists, with the Lassalleans. So, and both of those moments are sort of taken up in the Johnston piece in terms of the way that Marx is thinking the question of organization. So perhaps, in what sense is the attempt to reinstate like bourgeois private property and labor? So like, with like Proudhon, that we might have like, credit societies of exchanging the products of our labor without a state.
Right. Like labor vouchers, the labor
exactly.
exchanges.
So
there were other forms of this as well. Yeah. Yep. There were other.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if you want to finish that thought or.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah. So how are these like attempts to reinstate the value of labor, to reinstate private property and labor in that sense, actually beginning to open up this need for a new kind of party?
Right. So there's various forms in which this takes. Labor vouchers and labor exchanges being one. The cooperatives, both producer cooperatives and consumer cooperatives were another form. Were other forms in which the workers tried to recapture what was kind of being destroyed in the process of industrialization. Of course, the trade unions are, in a sense, the principal example, the most important example, because they are the most acute expression of they're the most acute expression of the struggle as a conflict between the classes, between the workers and the employers, over the terms of employment, over the terms of the production process. And in a sense, for Marx and Engels, they represent in embryo, not yet fully developed, but in embryo, the struggle of the workers to take control of the system of industrial production as a whole. They're kind of, the unions point in that direction, but they only point in that direction in a very kind of tenuous way, in the sense that they can't actually achieve that end, and they can't even really go very far toward that end, right? They only kind of hint in that direction, but ultimately are always thwarted before they get very far. So, Engels talks about in The Condition of the Working Class in England, how the trade unions ultimately end up having a fundamentally kind of conservative character of, at best, preserving the value of the wages of the proletarians at the kind of market rate, at the equilibrium of supply and demand, at the value, if you would, the market value of the of labor power at that time, right? So if economic forces intervene that undermine the position of industrial production and hence undermine the ability of the workers to find employment, it drives up demand, or drives up the supply in the labor market relative to demand, and depresses the wage rate. And ultimately, if you're a capitalist employer, you can't just keep the wage rate at the same level, because the workers will revolt. Because if you don't reduce your costs adequately, you're going to go under, and you're not going to be employing anyone anyway. Right. So the unions are there to essentially, on the one hand, prevent wage reductions that are unnecessary, and on the other hand, when there's an upturn in the economy, to bring the wage level back up faster than it would kind of its own accord. Presumably, it may not rise at all. So the unions are really the principal example for Marx and Engels of this. They are kind of conservative and adapted to preserving the value of wage labor in the face of the ultimate impossibility of doing so. It's kind of a qualified impossibility because obviously it's still going on. It's kind of an impossibility in the sense of a continuously self-undermining proposition. So with regards to other phenomena, they all have something to contribute to this process of thinking through, working through the problem, but they all ultimately have kind of limitations, right? So there's, these various forms of organization we described. There's also the struggles for reforms, including democratic reforms as well as social reforms, that are seeking to kind of redress these conditions of the workers. And another remark, I was just reading The Condition of the Working Class, so apologies for making a lot of references to the text, but there Engels says something along the lines of, the demands the workers are raising may be outright reactionary, but what's important is that they are trying thereby to kind of take mastery over the conditions of their existence and their labor, right? So the specific demands, so for example, in terms of like the manifesto, right, the petty bourgeois socialist can demand to return to small scale commodity production, which he associates with Proudhon. And which, of course, the cooperatives are kind of based upon. If you have this vision of socialism as just cooperatives taking over the economy, then what you're really talking about is regressing to small-scale production, unless you're somehow proposing that cooperatives will be able to spontaneously develop to the point that they can outcompete large-scale capitalist enterprises, which is just not really realistic. Arguably, I guess you could argue that point, but certainly it hasn't happened yet. I mean, the biggest cooperative that's ever existed, Mondragon, basically just became a capitalist corporation. So, it's not an uninteresting example. And any example of this sort of attempt to work through and overcome these conditions with these inadequate means, which all, by the way, come out of the socialist movements, efforts to envision a transformation of society adequate to the potential that is kind of exhibited by the Industrial Revolution negatively. All these attempts, both in terms of practical efforts and the theoretical kind of frameworks that go along with them, are part of the process of clarifying what will ultimately be necessary. And while they all are, in a sense, too limited to actually achieve what might be, desired, this kind of overcoming of the problem, they nonetheless all have kind of a piece of truth. So, for example, the cooperatives, may not be able to actually replace capitalist industry on their own, right? But they do, as Marx puts it, give us an example of the fact that the workers are capable of organizing the production process for themselves, if only in small scales. But in principle, there's no reason they couldn't do the same thing on larger scales and ultimately the scale of the economy as a whole. And for that matter, the cooperatives may not have much of a substantial role in the movement before the workers seize power, but after they seize power, they may end up taking a very significant role in the reorganization of the economy, which is something Lenin talks about after 1917, for example. And the same thing with the labor exchanges, labor vouchers, as Marx says in the Critique of the Gotha program. That is how he envisions the organization of the first phase of socialism is on that basis. That doesn't mean under capitalism that implementing those sorts of things would, for one thing, get you to socialism, or for that matter, really do anything other than reproduce the problem in a different form, right? The problem that they're already struggling with in a different form, and ultimately an inadequate form that can't really get much traction. But nonetheless, it has a sort of educative value precisely because of its limitations, but in those limitations pointing beyond itself towards the higher necessity that's expressed in a kind of one-sided, inadequate way.
Yeah, and as so there were actually like American observers in France who were talking with the Proudhonists and came up with the idea of consumer insurance societies. So
Yep.
like,
Mhm.
so that was, it's like already things can be taken up within capitalism. And so maybe could you talk about then in the sense in which, so like how is the Communist League? What sort of advance but also difference is there between the Communist League and the First International?
Right.
Because one of the claims that Johnstone addresses is that the First International was itself the party, and he's emphasizing and you were emphasizing in your presentation that the broad democratic base. It's not because Bakunin is saying let's abolish inheritance or whatever his conception of like socialism is. That's not the, as you emphasized, that's not the reason why it was expelled. It was because he was like it was because he was contravening the democratic principle of the international itself, but he was trying to turn it into a secret conspiracy society, basically, right? So like maybe if we sort of speak about, especially at the level of like this, being able to learn in organizational consciousness, because I find it fascinating that you were saying that the Communist League itself was the attempt to spread Chartism.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if you could connect those two moments.
So first, let me just say, we've now done 2 sessions on this Johnstone piece, but the meat of his presentation is going through these various models of the party that crop up over the course of Marx and Engels's lifetimes. And I only really addressed what you might say is like the kind of core essential concept that's developed in these various forms. And I this is such a valuable piece to me that I'm sure I would like to come back to it in the future, to go into more depth on the whole exposition. But for the reason we're like reading through this right now is to help set up this engagement with the Ackerman argument about the new party and so on. So it was really that kind of core of what does it mean to have an independent party of the working class that was concerning me here. But just to say something about specifically those 2 models, the Communist League and the International. So of course, one of the themes of this piece is how the very concept of political party changes over the course of Marx and Engels' lifetimes, and in large part because of the role played by the working class parties, the working class socialist parties that they are instrumental in helping to develop. Not Chartism, which already existed, but those that would come later. So there is a sense in which the very meaning of what a political party is in flux over this period. And so not only are Marx and Engels using the term in various ways, but the very reference points, in society at large are changing as well. So party can mean anything depending on the context in which it's being used by Marx and Engels. Could mean anything from essentially kind of a loose association of like-minded people to a mass movement of the workers engaged in a class struggle, to various forms of organization, whether they be directly political, like the Lassallean Party or the Chartist Party, or in a sense, kind of proto-political or pseudo-political, or if you like, more economic and social than political, like the First International. Of course, implicit in Marx and Engels' participation in the First International was the notion that if this organization and the movement that it is, in a sense, seeking to lead and reconstitute or constitute for the first time, if this movement succeeds in developing and advancing its struggle beyond this kind of primitive phase that it's been left by the aftermath of the counter revolutions of following 1848, then inevitably it will develop to the point where the question of the political organization of the workers, which is to say the organization of the working class to take political power, would be on the table, right? So that's always there, like that's in the background, that will if this succeeds and doesn't just fall apart, that will eventually become, you know, that will eventually be on the agenda one way or another. That will be a controversy, a theoretical, strategic controversy that will arise within the movement by virtue of its development and its advancing when it reaches a certain level of maturity, and that question is presented, right? Um, so the Communist League is a very uh, it's a very kind of strange example in a certain sense because it represents a transition from an earlier form of revolutionary organization to what you might think of as sort of the precursors of the modern um, political party. And to some extent, you could see the Chartist organization as such a precursor as well. Although the Chartist organization, of course, is not a political party in the sense of, say, standing candidates for elections, because they don't have the ability to do that, right? They can't stand candidates. There are some, bourgeois, adherents or sympathizers that seek to represent the Chartist movement in Parliament. But in terms of the actual kind of working class constituency for Chartism, um, the workers themselves can't stand for parliamentary election, and they can't vote in parliamentary elections. And of course, that's what the charter is all about: is trying to redress that situation and earn those, democratic rights for the workers. So there's a sense in which it's kind of a proto political party, and it does have some of these precursor elements as well. But what's interesting about the Communist League is that it begins as the League of the Just, which is a conspiratorial, a Blanquist conspiratorial organization that's um, you know, seeking to um, provoke revolution in the old-fashioned way of instigating a political crisis that would lead to a sort of social upheaval that would sweep away the existing state and replace it with something else. And it has sort of a naive conception of what revolution would mean, even by the standards of the bourgeois revolutions. It's naive even from, it's not like that's what happened in the French Revolution. It's not like the Jacobins were there plotting from the beginning, like, how are we going to make this happen? Like, the Jacobins themselves emerge as a tendency within this broad social and political upheaval. But nonetheless, the kind of so there's a couple of things to think about with regards to the conspiratorial form of organization. It does have this sort of, you might say, naive and immature conception of revolution in terms of the conspiratorial vanguard that um, you know makes the revolution so that, or instigates the revolution so that the masses can rise up, right? Um, but there's also the conditions of counter-revolution, and the fact that the revolutionaries are dealing with, so to speak, conditions of illegality. They're trying to adapt to conditions in which they can't have an open political discourse about um, reviving the French Revolution, right? They can't do that out in the open, save in England. But we're talking about people on the continent where counter-revolution has reigned since the fall of Napoleon. And the question is, how do we revive the revolution under these extremely harsh repressive conditions of, essentially police states? And all of these organizations, both in the conspiratorial era and afterward, were thoroughly infiltrated by police agents of pretty much every European government. There's all sorts of anecdotes about Marx engaging with, people that he may or may not have known were police provocateurs and agents and spies and so on. But the Marx and Engels entering the Communist League, part of their conditions for entry, and they were, invited to join the Communist League. They were at that point promulgating their ideas through committees of correspondence, so essentially circulating, joint, circular letters to various participants in this kind of international communist revolutionary, world, underworld. They were invited to join because their theoretical perspective was, clarifying and made sense of things that some of the other people that the participants in the League of the Just had been looking to, like Wilhelm Weitling and Proudhon and Moses Hess. Marx and Engels provided a kind of clarity about what was actually going on and what would be necessary to, see the revolution go beyond its present impasse that these other theorists didn't provide, right? But part of their terms for joining the what became the Communist League, besides the change of name, was turning it into an open democratic organization. Because for Marx and Engels, as I said during my remarks, what was essential was promulgating these ideas publicly, openly. As they put it in the manifesto, the communists disdain to conceal their views, right? It's about spreading these ideas as widely as possible. Again, not because like Marx and Engels are like, we're right and you all have to listen to us, but because they want these ideas to be discussed and to be discussed in the context of the ongoing struggles so that they can help clarify these struggles and help develop the consciousness of the working class, to educate the working class in the course of its struggle, and to see beyond the limitations of kind of a merely bourgeois perspective that simply seeking to restore a bygone state of affairs, right? That's simply seeking to return, for example, to small scale commodity production or something like that. So they want these ideas to be in the movement so that the workers can think through what kinds of social transformation might be necessary and what it might take to realize that, right? Um, so the Communist League, nonetheless, is still subjected to pretty intense repression, especially once the revolutions of 1848 are underway. So they return to Germany, and it's not illegal because in the midst of the revolution, they're able to operate openly. But they are in a position where they're essentially no longer, they no longer need a kind of organization to promulgate their views, as a sort of like international. So the way the Communist League operated was it had these organizations called working men's educational associations that were, essentially social clubs that did lectures and had reading rooms, and provided education for the workers, general education, but also education in revolutionary politics, in political economy, etc. um, and the Communist League was kind of these were kind of like front organizations for the Communist League through which they could um, engage with the public without kind of directly promulgating these kinds of agitational, you know, uh, ideas that could potentially get them, you know, in trouble with the authorities. But once they're in Germany in the revolution of 1848, they're able to operate openly, but they're also in a position where communism is not really on the order of the day. There isn't a developed proletarian movement in Germany. There's only really the beginnings of a proletarianized working class, and really kind of primitive beginnings. It's really more of a kind of increasingly degraded artisanal, or handicraft, working class. And a lot of these German emigre radicals that are in the Communist League are artisans who went to work abroad and got in touch with these radical ideas as a result. Um, so they end up kind of not, there's a controversy over whether they dissolve the Communist League's central authority or whether they, what exactly happens. But they essentially sideline the league for a time during the revolution when they're essentially trying to operate within the democratic revolutionary current, as a pole of attraction for the working class to kind of, on the one hand, push the democratic revolutionary movement forward, but on the other hand, begin to raise consciousness of the eventual necessity of the working class organizing itself independently. So they're kind of doing both things at once. And they're not doing this through, the way they're operating is through public meetings and publishing a newspaper. It's through open public activity. So they don't really have need for the league. It's only later, when the revolution begins to collapse, when the petty bourgeois democratic movement sort of begins to vacillate and ultimately betrays the revolution, and essentially allows the absolutist Prussian state to come back in and take back over. That Marx and Engels begin to recognize that there is a role for the League, which, in a sense, it became necessary because of the development of the struggle, right? It got to the point where the workers could no longer simply go along with the petty bourgeois democratic movement, because they wanted to maintain a consistent revolutionary democratic perspective. And the official representatives of that trend betrayed that politics, right? So the prospect of organizing the working class independently comes back up with this betrayal. But by then, it's basically too late for the German Revolution. It's pretty much over at that point. So the famous address, the March address to the Central Committee of the Communist League, is Marx and Engels essentially laying out what they envision the role of the League to be in the resurgence of the revolution, which at that point they think it's imminent. The revolution's going to come back around. And relatively soon afterwards, they come to the conclusion, well, actually, we may be in for a long lull in revolutionary potential, and a long period of counter-revolution restoration. And so we might need to rethink what we're doing. And it's at that point that they essentially break with the League, dissolve the League. And they do so because the other leading elements of the League essentially think that they can just keep the revolution going by force of will, because they are such skilled agitators that they can whip up the workers into a frenzy, and the revolution will just be, a matter of time. You just have to, agitate people enough, and they'll, revolt, essentially. So it's at that point that Marx and Engels kind of give up on not just the Communist League, but also the entire milieu of communist revolutionary politics that had existed up to that point. And they go into a kind of theoretical isolation to work on their perspective, because they think it's only a matter of time. It may not be imminent, like immediately, but it is only a matter of time before the movement is revived. And we want to be prepared when that happens to provide to the movement, as it's reemerging, the theoretical means of clarifying what it needs to do, so that it doesn't fall into the same traps that led to the destruction of the Chartist movement in England, the massacre of the social democratic proletarians in Paris in the June days, and the collapse of the German petty bourgeois democratic movement before the workers could even begin organizing themselves independently in a meaningful way. So just to wrap up quickly, I know I went on for a while there, but that's what this First International represents, is the first significant indication that the movement is coming back around. Like, there were precursors to it that led to the formation of the First International, that showed the workers were beginning to regain their bearings in terms of both their struggle economically and politically. And so Marx and Engels Marx first and then Engels later was invited to participate in the First International from its outset, which he was initially kind of skeptical of, because of his esteem as a theoretical voice of the working class movement in the earlier revolutionary period. And ultimately, he's able to not just have this kind of esteemed position within its leadership, but to become the leading force of the International by virtue of both his reputation, but also because of the fruitfulness of his guidance and leadership, which is rooted in his theoretical perspective. So,
yeah. So that theoretical perspective being a perspective of history. So Thomas on Twitch asks, Is the task of Marxists today once again to raise consciousness of the historical process that has led to the crisis of bourgeois society? And then, or what, if anything, does this history tell us about how Marxists today can move us closer to the formation of a new proletarian party? So, yeah, so that's what we were sort of trying to draw out. How does the attempt, so in terms of like, what is the party for, making the class in itself for itself. It is this theoretical consciousness that is forming the party, that's forming the class by means of the party is historical. It's about how we can't repeat the bourgeois revolution. It's about how this new technique is accumulating experience in that manner. So in terms of today, then I suppose Thomas is asking, is the task of Marxists today once again to be conscious of the historical crisis that has the crisis of bourgeois society?
It's a great. I mean, that's the $1 million question, really. And I don't, so I'll give you my sort of my attempt, but who can say, really? I mean, I certainly think that is, if Marxists still have a task, it still is that task, because that's really the only task of Marxism, right? The only reason Marxism exists at all is to facilitate the development of the class consciousness of the proletariat, such that it's able to grasp and carry through to the end its historic task, its historic mission. And once that is underway, Marx doesn't really have anything to contribute anymore, or that's the core of Marx's contribution in any case. But it's a difficult question, because we have to kind of grapple with the fact that we are facing a completely unprecedented set of circumstances with regard to how we would go about undertaking that task today, right? So if you look at these different examples of Marx and Engels, the different forms, the different models of the party, the one example that sort of resonates with our condition today is the period in the 1850s following the defeat of the revolutions and the triumph of the counter-revolution, in which Marx and Engels kind of go into theoretical isolation. I think Marx puts it that he prefers the position of the independent writer to sort of playing games with these deluded revolutionary wannabes, and not because he's indulging in theory for its own sake or something, but because he wants to be prepared, as I said a moment ago, to re-engage the movement when it comes back around. But the lull of counter-revolution that followed the collapse of the revolutions of 1848, was a little over a decade. It wasn't the same magnitude as what we're facing, namely a period of counter-revolution and a period of kind of fallow fields for developing proletarian class consciousness. Not in the sense that there is no forms of class struggle, or no, at least kind of embryonic forms of what could develop into a class struggle today. Not that there is nothing, but in the sense that the memory of this entire revolutionary epoch and its stakes and its potentials and its apparent tasks, all of it has been so thoroughly destroyed in the minds and the memories of people who are living, whether by being completely forgotten or being remembered in forms that completely distorts what was actually going on, to the point that there's like really no meaningful way of trying to translate it into the present. There was a remark I think Engels wrote to Marx during the 1850s about some kind of reactionary Prussian newspaper, and he said something to the effect of, with the victory of the counter-revolution, the memory of the revolution is completely lost. It's for the younger generation as if history came to an end in 1847, right? So the entire memory of that revolutionary um, moment was sort of wiped away. And it did come back. It wasn't lost forever. But we're now facing like over 100 years, not a decade, but over 100 years of the loss of this and degradation of this historical consciousness. So that to the extent that Marxism is preserved today at all, it's preserved by people that abet the distortion and confusion of what Marxism was once trying to clarify. And they do so in the name of Marx, right? In the name of Marxism, they contribute to further confusion and obscurity and of this entire set of problems. So that's really when I said the fields are fallow. It's not so much because the working class is not capable of becoming a revolutionary force again. As some that's been sort of a diagnosis of what happened over the 20th century in some quarters. I don't think that's the case, but what I think is the case is that there is no that the obstacles to um, clarifying this history and the place of the present within it are profound, and they're profound not just because um, not just because there's like a massive distortion and confusion and forgetting of history, but because the kind of most promising attempt to theoretically clarify the modern revolutionary process, namely Marxism, it's under that banner that the confusion is most kind of intensely generated and promulgated. So I think there's a lot of different things that Marxists today might see as their task. Organize the working class. Uh, you know, uh, you know, develop class consciousness, develop the theoretical means of class consciousness, and so on. Yes, sure, and I'm certainly trying to do the latter in some meager capacity with this project. But there is, a whole another element to the problem, which is the kind of smokescreen of confusion that's cast over this entire history and its potential stakes in the present by the defeat, the collapse, the degeneration, disintegration, vulgarization of the socialist movement over the course of the 20th century, from its initial crisis and collapse following World War I to essentially a century of compounding of the problem of bad education and confusion. So I think that's something else that needs to be dealt with, and that's not a matter of kind of clarifying the historical consciousness of the working class and its struggle. That's more a matter of dealing with the liability of contemporary socialists and Marxists in undermining the potential appeal of these ideas to the very audience they're meant to, apply to. So that's kind of another big problem. Um, but how do you do it? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that's something. So for dealing with that problem of the kind of obstacles, theoretical obstacles, is the mission of the Platypus Affiliated Society, which I'm a member of and Clint's a member of, and I think Platypus has its approach to kind of trying to create better conditions for socialist Marxist intellectuals to operate, to first learn about this history in the first place and then do something with it in the future. And I think Platypus does it, is probably in my mind the best attempt to do something about that problem. But that's only part of the problem. And what about these other things? What about, as you say, raising consciousness of the historical process? What about that? What about, in a sense, positively promulgating Marxist ideas? Well, what would the audience for those ideas be? Of course, there you might find an audience in, for example, this audience, people interested in socialist ideas, Marxist ideas. And assuming you can get around the liability of all the confusion and bad education that I was just describing, thing to raise those ideas amongst young, intellectual people interested in this history and these ideas. But really, the core task is to raise this consciousness within the movement of the proletariat, and that raises a whole huge other set of questions, namely, I mean, you can imagine what those are. I won't keep rambling on about that, but so I'm sorry if that's not a satisfying answer. I think I've been struggling with this frustration over this question since I kind of first became convinced I was a Marxist. And I feel like I have something of a grasp of what the problem is now in a broad sense, but in a kind of concrete sense of like actually doing something about it, it's not an easy question to answer. And I'm just trying to do my small part to contribute, so hopefully that it helps in some way. But
Certainly, and perhaps rather than thinking about like, do we need some sort of pragmatic guideline or some sort of pragmatic, oh, should we be doing this? Would a Marxist be doing that? It seems that you've been pointing to two sorts of parts of the problem. On the one hand, like you were like when it's precisely because Marx was the revolutionary who said after 1848 the revolution is dead, long live the revolution. That the First International actually had a consciousness of a task at all, and that arguably the Second International took on the character that it did as a Marxist international, and not just a hodgepodge, so to speak, of ideas. So on the one hand, there's this sort of theoretical historical issue of what kind of intention did the 19th century have? What was the if we're not living in the future that the past wanted, how could the 19th century itself be critiquing the sort of degenerate horizons that we have today? On the other hand, I'm curious what you might think of, to be a bit more practical in that sense, like sort of base building attempts, where the point of civil society, civil social organizing, wouldn't be immediately to be taking power to get, socialists or progressives elected, but actually to start, forming better human material for socialism. I mean, we live in, neoliberal lumpenization, PMC degeneration. So, is there a specific way in which like practice could be developed in terms of actually, building human material in that way, for the task and consciousness of socialism?
Here, I'm just gonna let my dog out. Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not really, I'm not somebody who's like a skilled organizer of anything, so I'm not really, oh, geez, I'm not really probably the person with the best sense of what is possible in that regard and what it would take to do it. I have kind of a vague sense. But I definitely think I'm sure that there's a lot of potential. I'm not really sure what forms it would take. I mean, certainly in order to do anything meaningful in terms of kind of bringing these ideas into the real movement in whatever relatively primitive condition it is presently in, of permeating the real movement with Marxist ideas, and when I say Marxist ideas, it's not like I mean Marx's idea of what socialism would be, because as I said in the presentation, I think this is really important. Marx's conception of socialism is really negative. It's not a positive vision of what society will be like. The famous kind of ban on images of the future society is not like some sort of conceit. Like, it's essential to Marx's entire conception of what the revolutionary process is, right? Namely, that it is the self-determination of society, of the immense majority of people, in a manner that is wholly unprecedented in history, and that there is, in a sense, no way we could circumscribe theoretically beforehand, right? It's about unleashing this potential for change that is kind of dormant within the masses of people that constitute society. Um, so, there is, it's not as if what we're talking about here is like bringing Marx's vision of socialism to the people. It's really about reviving consciousness of socialism in a general sense. Socialism as a movement, as a kind of ideological movement, encompassed of an enormous array of different ideas of what society could be like and should be like. And for Marx, of course, the point was never like that one or the other of these visions was correct. It was rather that they all were grasping at a potential for change in, somewhat obscure ways, and confused ways, but nonetheless important ways. Um, and the task wasn't to like figure out which one of these visions was the right one and go with it. It was rather to work through why those potentials were appearing and being articulated in these ways and appealing to the working class, as they did, and in a sense using this kind of working through of the ideas of what kind of social transformation the Industrial Revolution made possible, as a way of clarifying what the struggle of the working class is actually about. So it's not simply a defensive struggle to maintain its position, in bourgeois society as wage laborers. It's a matter of fundamentally transforming society. And then the question is, well, what makes that fundamental transformation necessary? What imposes that necessity on the working class? And what will it take to realize that? And those are the kinds of questions that need to be dealt with in the practical development of the working class movement. It's not something, again, that can be kind of answered ahead of time. But the value of these different socialist ideas, it's not so much their positive kind of conceptions of what society will be like. It's really more a matter of their sort of critical reflection of potentials in society that are being unleashed, but that aren't able to be fully realized under capitalism, right? And so that the point would be that those potentials are what needs to be sort of grasped and articulated in the struggle of the working class, to overcome its condition in capitalism. Um, but in terms of like bringing those ideas into the real movement, again, we're talking about a movement that's in a relatively primitive state by like a Marxist conception, right? Certainly, if we restrict ourselves for the moment to the United States, um, both because it's what I'm familiar with, but also because, in a sense, it's the most significant um, place in the world with regards to world revolution. I mean, if you want to make a world revolution, it needs to um, sooner or later it needs to affect the heart of global capitalism, which is the United States. Or, what's the joke? Like, socialism never works because the CIA always comes in and destroys it or something. Of course, that's kind of like a crude. That's not really accurate, but there's like a kernel of truth to it, which is that so long as the United States is there, it's going to threaten attempts to develop a revolutionary socialist movement um, around the world. Not in the sense that the United States is like doggedly opposed to such politics. It may find it opportune to use such politics to its advantage geopolitically from like a realist perspective. But nonetheless, the point would be, if the heart of global capitalism isn't claimed by the revolution, then it falls apart, right? And ultimately, the United States would be tasked with enforcing whatever aftermath of that kind of falling apart would be. So to get to like the heart of the question, what we're talking about is something that would require like an army of people, um, who are skilled in forms of organization and social action that most of the people that are engaged in these discussions, I don't think are particularly skilled in, namely, going out there and like organizing people on the ground in concrete ways. You need people with those skills who are dedicated to these ideas and who are willing to bring them into the real movement by engaging it in a pretty, at the primitive level that it's currently at. Um, but where do you get that army of people? I mean, you can't do it with a handful of people in any meaningful way. And you can't do it with a bunch of people who are sort of like, theoretical, dilettantes who, and I speak, speaking self-critically here, who wouldn't be able to like persuade, uh, you know, um, who wouldn't be able to persuade like members of a union to listen to what I have to say if I went to like a union meeting or something like that. That would be kind of an absurdity to try to do that. So what you end up getting when you get people who want to engage with the working class movement where it is and begin this process, they end up having to adapt to the conditions of that movement, which means adapting to the bureaucratic degeneration of the trade union movement, essentially adapting to the uh, union bureaucracy and its conservative character, which is of course, exemplified by its, attachment to the Democratic Party. So these are kinds of questions that I think I'm going to get at a little bit in the subsequent weeks where we're dealing with the Ackerman plan. So maybe I can deal with this a little bit more substantively there. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's a big job that we don't really have the people to do that job. And I'm certainly not capable of doing it. And I don't know how you develop the capacity to do it. So, um, yeah, I don't know, but I do think it's important to put these ideas out there and to clarify as best as possible what is so often confused and muddled, so that at least that's there as like a resource. I think that's one way of contributing, however modestly. So
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think that's going to be a great way of sort of plugging the next sorts of things, because if we think generationally, if we think in terms of historical cycles, so to speak, there actually was an opportunity with post neoliberalism. And so it really is a question of consciousness that the level that the question is posed at. And even if we do try to like do tenants tenants organizing, or like community organizing, or even union, these are all liberalism, right?
right.
Which is not an insult. It's just like it is liberalism that we're doing when we are organizing civil society in some sort of way.
Adam Smith says that wage laborers should form unions in The Wealth of Nations.
Right. Yes. Yes. And so I guess on the one hand, my question would be, where is the real movement right now? If the socialists are incompetent or not to be found, or theoretically it's very unclear to themselves, like how should we understand what the real movement is right now? Like of the work, what are the where are the masses, so to speak? And then on the other hand, Thomas asks, I agree that we have fallen below the consciousness of Marx. Has society fallen below the historical threshold of even classical liberalism?
Well, we can address this, I think, quickly. It's a good question, but it's so yes, but that was what capitalism was in the first place, right? Capitalism already was this kind of self-contradiction of bourgeois social relations, and hence of the kind of liberal self-consciousness of that society. Capitalism already was this kind of violation of liberal principles by the very society that was supposed to live by those principles. And so when Marx is indicting the bourgeoisie, he's not indicting bourgeois social relations or the kind of values and principles based upon them. What he's doing is he's attacking the bourgeoisie for vulgarizing their own ideals, their own principles, their own aspirations. He's attacking them for falling below the threshold of their own kind of inherited revolutionary project and their precursors in that project. And when he looks to the proletariat, he sees in the proletariat, on the one hand, the only element in society that is seeking to uphold those principles in the face of their vulgarization. And of course, it's the struggle of the working class to make good on the promises of liberalism that provokes the vulgarity of the bourgeoisie in the sense of the apologistic appropriation of whatever comes to hand in order to rationalize and justify the suppression of the illiberal suppression of the working class struggle. um and on the other hand, in the working class movement, he sees the potential, again, not just to kind of uphold these classical liberal principles and values, but to see the potential for a transformation beyond them that's imminent within them, in specifically in their crisis, right? So within classical liberalism, the point isn't that that's like the final form of society, but that it is a step a step forward in the development of human freedom, and that it has succeeded to the extent liberalism has succeeded to the extent that it has laid the groundwork for the next step beyond the society that it reflected ideologically. And so long as we stay within that form of society and don't follow through on that transformation, we're not remaining true to liberalism and to bourgeois society. We're degrading it. It's regressing below its own threshold. And so the point would be, in order to realize classical liberalism after the Industrial Revolution, you need to go beyond the form of society of which it was the intellectual reflection, which doesn't mean disregarding liberal principles. It means realizing them in a way that goes beyond what they meant in the bourgeois epoch. It means realizing a kind of deeper, more profound significance to these ideas and values than they were even able to have in the time of their original emergence. So so hopefully that's a satisfactory answer. But Clint, remind me, you were making raising another question that maybe we can end off on. Or if we should maybe end there.
We can. I mean, it's a big question. Like, so how should we understand where the real movement is now?
Right.
Right. Because you were describing how, like, it's the sectarian who says, like, oh, I have the answer. I'm going to go to the working class and just tell them.
Well, I'll say this. I think I want to come back to this question in a much more thoroughgoing way when we read some pieces by Hal Draper, who I think had one of the most sophisticated and serious attempts to raise this question at the moment that, like, hope was seemingly lost. And I don't know if Draper's answer is the right one or not. I think it's definitely worth considering. I don't think there's many other attempts to think through that kind of question that are as serious as the one he was engaged in. And it's especially interesting because, so just to give a brief kind of preface or teaser, Draper had the sense that it was going to require engaging with the existing labor movement, which is to say the existing trade unions. So the question was, what kind of engagement would that be? So where is the real movement? Well, the unions are bureaucratically degenerated, and they are, entirely, sclerotic, and their memberships are by and large inactive and discontented with them, or, complacent with them. And, it's kind of a pale shadow of what the unions once represented. But nonetheless, like, those are the organizations of the working class that still exist in some form, however, far gone. And in those organizations, the organizations are dominated by these sclerotic bureaucracies, but they aren't just bureaucracies. They are also the membership. However complacent or discontented or inactive or whatever the members may actually be in any given union, those are still the places, those are still the organizations in which there are elements of the working class that are organized around their interests as workers, maybe not as a class in the sense of the ultimate political task, but in a sense that, kind of points in that direction, however obscurely. So Draper's sense was that the priority, or at least a priority, would be to engage with the unions. So he was thinking this around the same time as the so-called industrial turn of the New Left, right? And his organization the organization that he helped found and was part of, but that he very quickly around this time left and ended up abandoning sectarian politics altogether as a consequence, were involved in this industrial turn, this turn to the unions, to the factories, this attempt to proletarianize the student radicals of the New Left by sending them to work in various factories to join unions or to seed unions. Draper split with his organization, which was by that time known as the International Socialists, the precursor of the ISO and Solidarity. He was kind of persuaded to, or he was driven to break with his organization and abandon everything that they had been trying to do, essentially, and devoted himself for the rest of his life to this intellectual project of clarifying Marx's theory of revolution in this massive 5-volume work. And so I think I want to look at this in more detail when we look at his pieces. But I think Draper was onto something in the sense that he saw a necessity that the New Left generation did try to take up, but that they botched. And that subsequently what we now have is either you try to do what those New Left generation people tried to do again, which is not going to work for the same reasons it didn't work then, or you try to find some other route than engaging with the unions, whether that be some other form of social movement or some other form of labor organization or whatever. But I think Draper's perspective is worth considering, and I think it's ironic that very popular in the DSA circles is this idea of the rank and file strategy, which comes out of Solidarity and which is, in a sense, an attempt to preserve this legacy of the Draper tendencies, turned to the unions in the early 70s. The DSA milieu is very taken with this idea of the rank and file strategy, but they haven't taken on board Draper's critique, right, of why that didn't work and what they're missing. Like, in a sense, there's something else that's necessary that is not being taken into account here, and that is, in a sense, being lost. Something essential is being lost here. And ultimately, for Draper, that's the question of politics and the role of theory and theoretical clarification and the dialectic of theory and practice in the political project of building a socialist party, building a socialist movement. So that's kind of what he was at the end of his life trying to find a way to contribute. He was trying to contribute in some way to that. Whether he succeeded or not, or whether he was right or not, I think it's definitely worth considering his perspective. So we'll do that in a future session, probably in a few weeks. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Reed. And for our viewers, our co-host for intellectual self-defense has the Rona, and so we will be postponing that till later.
That's unfortunate.
Either later in the week or next week. So we'll be in touch about that. Thank you very much, Reed, and we'll see everybody same time next week.
All right, great. Take care.